Learning how to learn and learning how to motivate ourselves to master the hard topics is what creates a gap between the highest performers who come first and everybody else. The problem is that no one ever really teaches us how to study. I've spent most of my life being a self-taught learner. As a medical student, a doctor, and an entrepreneur, I've had to teach myself to learn lots of topics that initially seemed pretty hard or a bit boring, like the hundreds of eponymous syndromes in neurology that all seem quite similar. Now, when you encounter something that you feel is hard or uninteresting, the temptation is to think it's difficult because your ability is lacking and you're just not smart enough, when actually it's because you don't have a method for teaching yourself the hard things. So in today's video, I want to show you my step-by-step process that I use to easily learn difficult topics that makes them interesting, relevant, and most importantly, easier to learn. Being able to teach myself how to learn hard things is the single most life-changing skill that I've taught myself. I'm going to keep this practical and combine my own personal experiences with evidence-based study techniques on learning and some neuroscience on how our brains form memories. So do hit that subscribe button if you haven't already done so, and let's dive into my 5-step process that I use to easily learn difficult things. Now, for the purposes of showing you in detail, today we're going to be learning about Bell's palsy, which is one of those eponymous neurology topics that can seem confusing and hard when you first encounter it. If you're not a medic, don't worry, as the principles can be applied to lots of different topics too. And if you stick around till the end of the video, I've also added in a second example looking at how you can apply this to calculation-based studies like maths. So the first step in the process that I use to easily learn difficult topics is to make the topic we're learning relevant and personal. The problem with being told to learn things is that it's kind of thrust upon us. We don't necessarily naturally want to learn certain topics as at face value, they just don't seem that interesting. They're just chapters in a textbook that we've been told to learn by somebody. While you can force yourself by thinking, I need to learn this for an exam to get a job, that only goes so far to boosting your motivation and your interest. The reason we find learning these new topics difficult is because we lack context, we're not deeply emotionally invested or motivated enough to push through and figure them out, and we often just don't know how to teach ourselves full stop. If you keep coming up against difficult topics or you find things hard to recall, you can start to think that you're not smart enough. But this isn't the case. If we look at cognitive load theory for a second, we can see that if something is uninteresting to us, we won't focus our attention on it to move it into our working memory. Now, if that information is also too complex or not related to any existing knowledge we have in our working memory, we'll easily get overloaded, as our working memory has a limited capacity, which is known as our cognitive load. So the first step is to hack that attention and encoding portion of memory formation and make whatever we're learning deeply interesting and relevant to us to reduce our cognitive load. In order to learn, when our brains first encounter new information, the information needs to grab our attention, since our brains naturally filter out the tons of irrelevant information which we encounter every day. This is why neurodiverse people or people with ADHD really struggle to find things interesting. And we want to try and link that information to things we already know. This is what memory masters do, and it's the reason why you can easily remember things that have strong emotional connections. So let's take this example of Bell's palsy, which maybe isn't that interesting, and make it interesting and anchor it to something that we connect with. So a great way to do this is actually to head over to Google. And in order to encode effectively, our brains need to focus our attention and then process things in small chunks, which are linked to our existing memories. So what I'll usually do is I'll go to Google Images first to look for any easy to understand diagrams. And then I'll head to videos or YouTube to see if there are any quick explainers or preferably worked examples. And then I'll head to the front page or news tab to look for any interesting stories that really grab my attention. So if I type in Bell's palsy here to my laptop, a quick Google search shows some images of human faces so I can immediately see the signs. As this is an image, it's visually obvious. Now, as I'm scrolling down here, I can see a picture of Angelina Jolie, and it looks like she actually suffered from this, which immediately links a new concept to something that I already know, in this case, a famous actress. Now, this has grabbed my attention and I'm genuinely intrigued because I actually didn't realize that Angelina Jolie suffered with Bell's palsy. Now, if I click through, I can see that this article gives a full breakdown of her struggles. And more than that, as this is a personal account, it adds emotion, and as the article is written as a story, it provides context and anchoring way beyond if we were to just read this in a paragraph in a textbook or from Wikipedia. What we're doing here is we're moving this very fact-based concept of a medical condition with an eponymous syndrome named after someone that we might encounter in a lecture or a textbook, and we're giving it meaning by connecting it to something we already know. In learning science, storytelling helps with learning because stories are easy to remember. Organizational psychologist Peg Newhouser found that learning which stems from a well-told story is remembered more accurately and for far longer than learning derived from facts and figures alone. Similarly, psychologist Jerome Bruner's research suggests that facts are 20 times more likely to be remembered if they're part of a story. Now, I know what you're thinking. Googling something is pretty basic, right? Well, that's actually kind of the point. Textbooks and lecture slides are often written by academics, and they can seem overly complicated. Consumer-facing articles, on the other hand, are written by ordinary people who are experts at writing copy that's understandable and easy to follow. Remember, Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman was also known as the Great Explainer for his ability to explain complex topics in simple terms that his students could understand. By reducing the complexity of new information, we're optimizing the intrinsic load on our brain, which is the burden imposed on our short-term memory by the difficulty of the material. And by linking new information to our existing information, in this case via a story about Angelina Jolie, we're optimizing our germane load by better organizing the new information prior to encoding. If it's simple, obvious, and makes a hard topic easy, it's exactly what we want to give you a good understanding and overview before we head to the second step in the process for learning difficult topics, which is to dive deeper and really get curious about what we found. So now that we've anchored the topic of Bell's palsy and it's got our attention with some images and a relatable story about Angelina, it's time to get curious to stimulate further learning. Being curious is a massively underrated skill. If making things relevant grabs our attention, getting curious is really what drives learning, and if you can get curious about uninteresting topics, you'll be able to learn absolutely anything. So sticking with our Bell's palsy example, if the article you found piques your interest, start to read through certain areas and ask questions. Immediately I'm thinking, why has Angelina Jolie developed a Bell's palsy to begin with? What's the underlying cause? What's the pathophysiology? By being curious, you begin to peel away the layers around a topic and build understanding. If we were to just read a textbook or try to rote learn this information from the article, that would be pretty superficial learning. We'd just be memorizing facts for the sake of it without much deeper understanding. Memorization of facts is at the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy. And Bloom's taxonomy is a schema guiding your depth of mastery of a topic, from simply remembering something at the bottom to applying knowledge and teaching others at the top. This is where getting curious comes in. When reading this article or reviewing images or going to a short YouTube video on Bell's palsy, I'm actively thinking about how it relates to my existing knowledge. I might even Google something else, like what are the causes of Bell's palsy or what is the history of Bell's palsy. In learning science, this is something called elaborative rehearsal, where you're not just looking superficially, but are meaningfully engaging with the content as it interests you. I'm naturally going to videos, I'm looking up things, and I'm diving down a rabbit hole to quell my thirst for knowledge. If you're not curious enough about the topic, you need to go back to step 1 to really drive that interest. But if you are curious, you can then head to step 3 in my learning process for easily learning difficult topics. Okay, so now once you've built some context and linked the hard topic to your existing knowledge, step 3 is to chunk up the content and focus on 1 or 2 things to learn at a time. You can do this by making a study plan or mind map out what you need to learn. Sticking with Bell's palsy again, you might want to plan to study the pathophysiology, signs, symptoms, tests, and management. You can then chunk this up into a timetable and focus on 1 area at a time. Chunking reduces your cognitive load and allows you to stay laser focused on 1 section at a time to reduce the chance of getting distracted. One of the problems with becoming curious and interested in a topic is that it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. You can continue asking questions and unpeeling layers of a topic for a longer period of time, which isn't that efficient when studying. Instead, if you focus your curiosity around chunks of information, it's a much more efficient way to learn and spend your time. For example, I might focus my curiosity first on the causes of Bell's palsy and try and understand why it happens and the disease process behind it. To stay efficient, I might set myself a false deadline, since according to Parkinson's law, a task will fill the time allocated to it. At the end of this deadline, regardless of how far I've got into learning, I'll challenge myself to summarize the causes in simple terms following the Feynman method. But what happens if, when you're being curious and focused and chunking, you come across something that you just don't understand? Well, we'll look at more of this in the final step of the process shortly, but in essence, if you do come up against a wall, don't worry too much at this stage. It's not that you're not smart, it might be that you either need a break or you need to mix up how you're learning and start embracing getting things wrong. And this is what the next step, step 4, is all about. Step 4 in the process moves from encoding to ensuring that we can remember the new content and moves up Bloom's taxonomy to beginning to apply our knowledge. To do this, we need to use active recall and spacing to really test ourselves on the hard topics. In simple terms, once you've grounded the content in your reality, become curious and chunked it up, you can now start to self-test. A great way to do this is to close your books and simply ask yourself to write out as much about each of the chunks as possible. For example, can I write out all the signs and symptoms of Bell's palsy right now? You should be able to visualize Angelina Jolie and the article about her to help you do this as a mental cue. Once you have self-tested, you can then go back over your notes or original source material and see what you got correct or incorrect. Now, as we know from the forgetting curve, we forget things. So you need to retest yourself at the start of your next study session and at set intervals to ensure that you remember the new content. If there were some elements which you still find difficult to understand, worked examples and practice questions can help to provide frameworks. This is especially helpful when learning new concepts in subjects like maths and physics with lots and lots of calculations. Worked examples or partially solved questions help to reduce your cognitive load while explaining things in practical terms which you can try yourself. The more you test yourself over intervals of time, the better it will stick. But when learning difficult topics, the space in between is actually much more important to learning. In learning science, this is known as diffuse thinking, and it's what happens when your mind relaxes, providing space for daydreaming and wandering thoughts. It's something that many people miss or undervalue. It's the fact that even when your conscious mind stops concentrating on something, your brain will continue to process, ponder, and think about it. For me personally, if I'm struggling with any kind of decision or can't quite figure out something I'm learning, I'll take a break, go for a walk, hit the gym, or do something else entirely and let my brain work on things in the background. Researchers even found that our brains consolidate memories and solve problems while we sleep. So taking a break or working on something else and then coming back to the hard topic at a later date may stop you from getting frustrated and giving up thinking you can't quite get it. Step 5 in the process is to remember that learning isn't linear and you need to be kind to yourself. You won't remember everything first time round, and you'll need to come back to the topic again and again, look at it from different angles, and self-test to really master it. Rather than worrying about reading the original article over again and again, instead focus on teaching others and linking what you've learned to new topics. Bloom's taxonomy reminds us that teaching and analysing are at the top of the pyramid and are indicators that you know a topic pretty well. With Bell's palsy, you might become curious about the differences between Bell's palsy and similar conditions such as Ramsay-Hunt syndrome. Now, to deepen your knowledge, you can go back to step 1 and Google Ramsay-Hunt syndrome. And guess what? When we do, it says that Justin Bieber was recently diagnosed with Ramsay-Hunt syndrome, and he even put out a video on Instagram showing his symptoms. You can then compare Angelina Jolie to Justin Bieber, and these anchored visual cues aid both encoding and recall of information we once considered very difficult. In both cases, we can really empathise with the people affected, which creates more of an emotional cue when recalling the information. To hit this home further, when I revised for surgical exams around my day job as a doctor, I didn't just go over practice questions once. I went over them 2 or 3 times, focusing on the ones that I got wrong in the last attempt. If I got a question wrong, I didn't think, damn, I'm stupid. I thought, awesome, I get to read the explanation and learn something new, and then I'll get it right the next time. Now, if you apply these 5 simple steps when you encounter something you perceive to be hard or you find boring, you'll have a framework, but also a new mindset where hard topics don't put you off. Now, okay, so for medicine where diseases affect real people, these human examples are pretty memorable. But what about things like maths? Well, let's go again real quick. Let's say I have no clue about something like Pythagorean theorem. Back to Google, I can see some quick images and even an 18-second video to help me reduce my cognitive load and explain things in simple terms. There's also a worked example where a quiz question is being answered for a magazine, and then there's a whole host of background information about how the theorem was first discovered, which is actually pretty interesting, and I want to start pulling on those threads to really find out a bit more information and make it personal. Following my steps, I then dive deeper, getting curious, chunk up the information, put the theorem into practice by doing some test questions, and then I'd go again and again until I knew I'd mastered it. Instead of having to learn it, I'm now actually interested in the topic. Now, school grades and exams lead us to believe that we might not be as smart as others who seem to easily master these hard topics. At work too, it can seem like people can pick things up faster than others. This leads to some people feeling like they're just not clever enough and they give up altogether. A few examples that I've seen from my own personal life is when studying medicine, people think that neurology is too complicated and so they put it off and worry about it the most when it comes to exams. When growing a business, you might have no idea where to begin with something like sales or marketing, so you just put it off. Or when practicing guitar, you just can't get some chords, so you stop practicing altogether and give up. We consider things to be hard when they're new and we struggle to find context, interest, or even a place to start to understand them. So we either don't try or we feel we're not good enough. This is totally wrong. Learning is all about breaking things down into simple, relatable, and easy to understand chunks, and then getting excited about learning new things in the first few hours of learning. To illustrate this point further, think back right now to the best teacher you ever had. Or think about Richard Feynman, who was known as the great explainer for his ability to explain complex topics understandably. The best teachers engage us, they make us curious, they provide worked examples, and they give us structure, so they show us a clear path to learn, and then they quiz us. When teaching yourself, you need to be the best teacher possible. If you're able to do this, you'll be able to learn anything at school, college, or in work faster and more effectively to get ahead in life, while also having more time away from work and study to enjoy yourself. The single most life-changing skill I've taught myself is how to teach myself, and specifically, how to learn hard things. This helped me rank first at surgical exams while studying less than my friends, and to quickly pick up difficult concepts when teaching myself how to grow a business. Now, we covered encoding and learning science in quite a lot of detail in this video. I actually have a great video about encoding, which I'll put up in the end cards, so do check that out for another practical deep dive. Let me know if you've got any questions about the topics I've covered, or anything you're finding difficult in the comments below, and I'll do my best to help you. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for being a subscriber to the channel. Do hit that subscribe button if you haven't already done so, and I'll catch you again in the next video.